When we think of childhood today, we often imagine a time of school, games, and learning, a stage of life set apart from adult responsibilities. In the Middle Ages, however, childhood looked very different. It was shorter, harsher, and closely tied to the survival of the household. From the moment a child was born, life was fragile, and the path to adulthood was shaped less by play and more by work, duty, and endurance. Children were an essential part of medieval society, but they were not always treated as a separate group with their own world. Instead, they were woven into the daily life of adults. A child might be carried on a mother's hip while she spun wool, or follow a father into the fields, or sit near a hearth while older siblings worked around them. Childhood was not a time set aside from labor, but a gradual introduction to it. The risks of childhood were many. Infant mortality was high, and many children did not survive past their first years. Disease, poor nutrition, and the dangers of childbirth claimed countless young lives. Those who did survive carried the marks of a hard environment. Illness, hunger, and accidents were constant threats. Parents loved their children, but they also knew that life was uncertain and loss was common. Yet childhood was not without warmth. Families taught children prayers, stories, and skills. They played simple games, sang songs, and took part in festivals. But at its core, childhood was seen less as a protected stage of innocence and more as a preparation for adult responsibilities. Boys and girls alike were expected to learn quickly, to contribute to the household, and to step into adult roles far earlier than we might expect today. In this way, growing up in the Middle Ages meant learning to live with hardship from the start. Children were loved and cared for, but they were also expected to endure and to take on duties as soon as they were able. Their lives remind us that in harsh times, even the youngest members of society carried the weight of survival. The beginning of life in the Middle Ages was uncertain. Childbirth itself was dangerous, both for the mother and the child. There were no hospitals as we know them today, and midwives, experienced women from the community, were usually the ones who guided births. They relied on knowledge passed down through generations, herbal remedies to ease pain, prayers to protect mother and child, and steady hands to bring new life safely into the world. Still, complications were common, and many women and infants did not survive the process. When a child was born, there was joy, but there was also fear. Families knew that survival in the first year was far from guaranteed. Illness, weakness, or simple misfortune could claim a baby quickly. Because of this, baptism usually followed soon after birth. Parents wanted to make sure their child was received into the church as quickly as possible, often within a few days, sometimes within hours. Faith and fear were closely tied at this stage of life. Infants were cared for primarily by their mothers, though other women in the household or community often helped. Babies were commonly swaddled, wrapped tightly in cloth to keep them warm and protected. This practice was thought to help limbs grow straight and strong, though it also limited movement. Mothers nursed their children if they could, but if not, a wet nurse might be employed, especially in wealthier families. Milk, warmth, and protection were the essentials of survival. Caring for infants meant constant attention. There were no cribs or strollers. Babies were carried, held, or laid near the hearth for warmth. A mother might spin wool or knead bread while rocking a cradle with her foot. In peasant homes, children grew up close to the rhythms of work, watching and listening as parents labored. The baby's cries, laughter, and needs were woven into the noise of grinding mills, clattering pots, and clucking chickens. Even in these early years, mothers introduced children to prayers and blessings. A child might not understand the words, but they learned the rhythms of faith as part of daily life. Songs, lullabies, and short verses passed down comfort and belief together. Religion and nurture were not separate but intertwined from the start. Illness remained the greatest danger. Colds, fevers, or infections could quickly become deadly without effective medicine. Herbs, poultices, and broths were used to treat infants, but outcomes were uncertain. Many families experienced the grief of losing children young, sometimes more than once. Despite this, each birth was valued, and each infant was welcomed with care and hope. Community played a role in early care as well. Neighbors visited mothers after childbirth, bringing food, helping with chores, or assisting with the baby. In noble households, servants provided help, while in villages, it was fellow women who gave support. Birth was not only a family matter, but also a moment of shared attention, drawing the household and community closer. These early years were fragile, marked by uncertainty but also by deep care. To grow past infancy was itself an achievement in the Middle Ages. Children who survived swaddling, sickness, and the hazards of early life carried with them the lessons of dependence and protection. They began their journey in a world that was harsh, but also sustained by the watchfulness of women, the strength of families, and the shared rhythms of community life. For the vast majority of medieval children, life was shaped by the rhythms of peasant households. They were born into villages surrounded by fields, forests, and pastures, and from an early age, they were drawn into the work that kept families alive. Childhood was not a long period of play or study, but a gradual introduction to responsibility. Even the youngest contributed in small ways, helping to support their families in the constant struggle for survival. The first tasks for peasant children were simple but important. A child old enough to walk steadily might be sent to carry water from the village well or stream. The heavy wooden buckets tested their strength, but the water was needed for cooking, brewing, and cleaning. Children also gathered firewood and kindling, scouring the edges of forests for sticks and branches. These were not glamorous tasks, but they were essential, for a home without fire could not cook meals or keep warm. As they grew older, children were drawn into the care of animals. Boys and girls alike might be sent to watch sheep or goats, leading them to pasture and keeping them safe from straying or predators. They collected eggs from hens, fed pigs, and milked cows if the family owned them. These tasks required patience and attention, teaching children responsibility. A careless moment could mean lost livestock, which for a peasant family could be disastrous. Work in the fields and gardens also began early. Children weeded rows of vegetables, helped plant seeds, or followed behind adults during harvest, gathering dropped grain or tying bundles. They scared birds away from crops, shouted to drive animals from fields, and carried smaller loads of hay or produce. During harvest time, every hand was needed, and children worked long days alongside parents and siblings. In between chores, children also learned domestic tasks. Girls often watched their mothers at the hearth, learning how to knead dough, stir pots, and spin wool. Boys might help with repairs, carrying tools, or holding wood while fathers worked. These lessons were not taught in classrooms, but in daily routines, repeated until they became second nature. By the time a child reached adolescence, they were expected to know the skills of adulthood. Life for peasant children was not without play, but even games were often tied to work. Children played with simple toys made from wood, cloth, or clay, a carved doll, a ball stuffed with rags, or whistles made from reeds. They wrestled, raced, and played games with stones or sticks. These amusements gave moments of relief, but they also built strength and skills that would be useful in later life. Play prepared children for the physical demands of labor. The home itself was a place of shared responsibility. Older children cared for younger siblings, carrying them, feeding them, or keeping them safe while mothers worked. This practice taught responsibility early, especially for girls, who were expected to help in child-rearing as part of their preparation for managing households of their own. Education for peasant children was practical rather than formal. Few learned to read or write, though some villages had priests who taught basic prayers or letters. Instead, children learned through imitation, observation, and repetition. A boy learned to swing a sickle by watching his father. A girl learned to spin wool by copying her mother. Skills were handed down directly, not through books, but through constant participation in daily life. Despite the demands of work, childhood was also shaped by the rhythms of the community. Children joined their families in village festivals, dancing or singing during feast days. They carried candles in religious processions, learned hymns, and observed rituals. They were part of a larger world of shared customs, which provided both structure and moments of joy in otherwise harsh conditions. The life of peasant children was marked by early maturity. By the time they reached their early teens, they were expected to work nearly as hard as adults. Their hands grew rough from labor, their bodies hardened by carrying, lifting, and walking long distances. They lived close to the soil, tied to the cycles of planting and harvest. Childhood was brief, and the line between child and adult blurred early. In this way, peasant children grew up with hardship but also with resilience. They learned endurance from the start, shaped by duties that demanded patience, strength, and cooperation. Their daily lives remind us that in the medieval world, survival was not only the responsibility of adults. It was a task shared by the whole household, including the youngest members, whose steady contributions helped keep families and communities alive. While most children in the Middle Ages grew up in peasant households, a smaller number were born into the families of nobles, knights, and lords. Their lives were shaped by very different surroundings: large manor houses or castles instead of simple cottages, servants instead of constant household labor. Yet noble children also faced expectations and challenges. Their childhood was not a time of freedom, but a period of preparation for the roles they were expected to play as adults. For noble infants, birth carried a mix of celebration and danger, much as it did for peasants. Families rejoiced at the arrival of heirs, especially sons who could carry on names and estates. Yet childbirth was still risky, and mothers and babies faced many of the same dangers as those of humbler families. Baptism followed quickly, ensuring the child was brought into the church and protected spiritually. Noble children grew up in larger households, surrounded by servants, tutors, and retainers. Wet nurses often fed infants instead of mothers, and nurses or governesses supervised young children. This meant that noble children were sometimes raised more by caretakers than by their parents, though mothers still played important roles in overseeing education, piety, and manners. A noble childhood was less about labor and more about training for leadership and responsibility. From a young age, noble children were instructed in manners and behavior. They learned how to sit properly at table, how to address their elders, and how to participate in ceremonies. Etiquette was more than politeness. It was a visible sign of rank, showing the difference between nobles and commoners. Mothers and tutors corrected speech, posture, and habits, preparing children to represent their families with dignity. Education was more formal than for peasants. Boys in noble families might be taught to read, write, and speak Latin, especially if they were expected to enter the church. Religious instruction was constant, with priests or chaplains providing guidance. Girls, while less likely to be taught Latin, still learned prayers, reading in the vernacular, and often music, embroidery, and household management. These skills reflected their expected futures: sons as leaders, daughters as managers of households, or wives in powerful marriages. For noble boys, the path to knighthood began early. Around the age of 7, many were sent away from their parents' homes to serve as pages in the household of another noble. There they learned horsemanship, basic combat training, and service. They carried messages, served at table, and watched knights at practice, gradually absorbing the discipline of the warrior class. In their teenage years they became squires, training more intensively in arms and assisting knights directly. By their late teens or early 20s, if they had proven themselves, they could be knighted. Childhood for these boys was less about play and more about steady preparation for a life of service and combat. For noble girls, the path was different but equally demanding. From an early age, they were taught the skills of household management, how to supervise servants, manage storerooms, and care for children. They learned embroidery and fine sewing, not only for clothing but also for church decorations and tapestries. Music and song were often included, as a lady was expected to bring refinement to her household. Just as boys were trained to defend and lead, girls were trained to manage and sustain. Marriage was one of the most important goals of noble childhood, particularly for daughters. Many were promised in marriage while still children, with arrangements made between families to secure alliances, dowries, and lands. A noble girl might know from a young age that her future was tied not to personal choice but to family strategy. Sons, too, were sometimes bound to arranged marriages, though they had slightly more freedom if they inherited titles or estates. Despite their wealth and privilege, noble children also faced hardship and risk. They were vulnerable to disease, accidents, and early death just like peasant children. Their training could be harsh, with strict discipline from tutors or masters. Their lives were closely monitored, their futures mapped out by others. The weight of expectation to become a capable knight, a dutiful lady, or a respected cleric hung over them from the start. At the same time, noble children enjoyed opportunities denied to peasants. They played with fine toys, carved figurines, small wooden horses, or even early board games. They practiced hunting, falconry, and riding. They heard stories of heroes and saints read aloud, shaping their imaginations. Their households were safer, with food more secure and servants ready to meet their needs. These comforts, however, were tied to the strict responsibilities of their class. In both peasant and noble worlds, childhood was brief. But while peasant children were pushed early into physical labor, noble children were pushed into structured training. Both paths aimed at the same outcome: adults ready to take on the duties demanded by their stations. Whether in a field or a hall, medieval childhood was less about innocence and more about preparation for the roles that sustained society. In the Middle Ages, education did not mean school for most children. Classrooms, books, and formal teachers were rare outside of towns, monasteries, or noble courts. Instead, most children learned through work, imitation, and repetition. Skills were passed down from parents to children, from older siblings to younger, and from masters to apprentices. The household itself was the classroom, and daily labor was the lesson. For peasant children, education was almost entirely practical. From the time they could walk and talk, they were expected to observe adults and copy their tasks. A boy might learn how to swing a hoe by following his father into the fields, first watching, then trying, then doing it daily until it became habit. A girl might learn spinning by sitting beside her mother, twisting fibers between her fingers, and slowly mastering the rhythm of spindle and distaff. No written instructions were needed. Knowledge came from experience, repeated until it became second nature. Children learned how to recognize the signs of the seasons, when to sow, when to harvest, when to prepare for winter. They memorized the look of ripening grain, the feel of healthy soil, and the timing of livestock births. They learned to judge weather by the clouds and to listen for the calls of birds that signaled seasonal change. This was education rooted in survival, passed down without books, yet vital for keeping households fed. For girls, domestic education was central. They were taught cooking, sewing, weaving, and caring for children. A daughter learned to manage food stores, to stretch supplies, and to bake bread in the shared oven. She learned how to mend torn garments, spin wool into yarn, and weave cloth for her family. These tasks prepared her to run a household of her own one day. From her mother, she also learned skills in health and care, how to prepare simple remedies, tend the sick, and ease childbirth. For boys, physical work dominated. They learned how to plow, thresh, chop wood, and care for animals. They practiced with tools, carrying lighter versions until they were strong enough to handle full-sized ones. Many learned craft skills from fathers or relatives: blacksmithing, carpentry, or building. In towns, boys were often apprenticed to masters, entering workshops where they worked for years in exchange for training, food, and shelter. Apprenticeships were the closest. Many came to formal education, but they provided lifelong trades. In noble families, education could be more formal, though it always reflected the roles expected of sons and daughters. Noble boys learned reading, writing, Latin, and sometimes music, but these lessons were balanced with training in horsemanship, hunting, and combat. By serving as pages in another noble's household, they were educated in discipline, courtesy, and service. Their education aimed to shape them into knights and leaders, ready to fight and to manage estates. Noble girls, while less often taught Latin or advanced reading, were still educated in ways that reflected their future duties. They learned to read prayers, sing songs, and perhaps play instruments. They mastered embroidery, sewing, and fine household skills, as well as the etiquette of noble society. A noble daughter was expected to be not only competent in running a household, but also a visible symbol of her family's refinement. Education was therefore practical, but also cultural, teaching her to present herself with grace. Religious education formed part of every child's upbringing, across class lines. Children learned prayers, the sign of the cross, and the rhythm of the church calendar. They were taught obedience as a virtue, framed both as social duty and as religious expectation. For some, education in monasteries or convent schools expanded this, offering literacy and deeper religious knowledge. For most, however, religious lessons came at home or in village churches, woven into daily life rather than set apart from it. Education in the Middle Ages was therefore less about books and more about skills for survival and duty. Peasant children learned the tasks of labor. Noble children learned the tasks of leadership. All children were expected to prepare for the adult roles that awaited them. Childhood was not about exploration for its own sake, but about gaining the knowledge necessary to keep households, estates, and communities alive. By the time a medieval child reached adolescence, they had absorbed years of silent instruction. They knew the weight of tools, the patterns of the seasons, the sound of prayers, and the duties of their class. Their education was not recorded in parchment or sealed with certificates, but it was no less real. It was written into their hands, their habits, and their endurance, shaping them for the adult lives they were soon to enter. Religion was at the center of medieval life, and children grew up surrounded by it from their very first days. Faith was not an activity set aside for Sundays alone, but the framework of the entire year and the rhythm of every household. From infancy, children were taught prayers, introduced to the rituals of the church, and guided to understand their duties not only to parents and lords, but also to God. Religion shaped their moral world, defining right and wrong, and tying obedience at home to obedience in heaven. The very beginning of a child's religious life came with baptism. Almost immediately after birth, parents arranged for their baby to be baptized by a priest. In part, this was out of fear of early death, which was all too common, but it was also to mark the child formally as part of the Christian community. From that moment, a child was considered bound to God's protection, though the expectations of faith were carried by the family until the child was old enough to participate directly. At home, mothers usually taught children their first prayers. The sign of the cross was one of the earliest gestures a child learned. The Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, and blessings before meals were repeated daily until they became second nature. Fathers might lead family prayers, but it was often mothers who ensured children remembered and recited them. Learning to pray was as natural as learning to speak, and it was one of the first forms of education medieval children received. The church calendar marked children's lives as much as the seasons of farming. Feast days, saints' days, Lent, Easter, and Christmas structured the year. Children fasted with their families, abstaining from meat when required. They joined processions in villages, carrying candles, singing hymns, and dressing in their best clothes. They learned that their own lives were tied to the larger cycles of the church, just as their work was tied to the cycles of the land. Religion also taught children about obedience and duty. Parents were seen as holding authority given by God, and so to obey them was not only a social obligation, but also a spiritual one. The fourth commandment, to honor father and mother, was repeated and emphasized. Disobedience was framed not just as defiance against parents, but as sin against God. In this way, religion reinforced discipline at home and in the community, ensuring that children grew up aware that loyalty and respect were more than personal choices. They were part of faith itself. Confession and penance also introduced children to the idea of personal responsibility. As soon as they were considered old enough, they were expected to confess sins to a priest and to perform the penance given. This could involve prayers, fasting, or small acts of service. These practices taught children that their actions mattered, that moral failings had consequences, and that forgiveness required humility and effort. For noble children, religious education could be more formal. Tutors or chaplains instructed them in reading Latin, reciting psalms, and understanding scripture. Girls might be taught to read devotional texts, such as books of hours, which contained prayers for each part of the day. These texts guided not only prayer, but also the rhythm of daily life, reinforcing the constant presence of religion. For peasant children, instruction was simpler but no less important. Priests in village churches taught catechism, prayers, and the basics of belief. Religious festivals gave children a sense of joy and belonging. Christmas brought feasts and music. Easter brought processions and celebrations of resurrection. Saints' days filled the year with special meals, church services, and local customs. These occasions gave children a sense of community, binding them to their neighbors and reminding them that faith was not only individual but shared. Moral instruction also included lessons about virtues and vices. Children were taught to value humility, patience, charity, and hard work. They were warned against pride, greed, laziness, and disobedience. These lessons were repeated through sermons, stories, and parental guidance. Religious tales of saints, martyrs, and biblical figures provided examples of behavior to follow or avoid. Even discipline was framed in religious terms. Harsh punishments were justified as correction, guiding children toward righteousness. A disobedient child might be reminded not only of family rules but also of God's commandments. Discipline in the household was seen as a reflection of discipline in the wider order of society and heaven. In this way, religion and moral instruction shaped children into adults prepared for their roles. For peasants, it reinforced obedience, endurance, and acceptance of their lot. For nobles, it reinforced responsibility, duty to their estates, and loyalty to the church. Across all classes, it bound children to a world where faith was inseparable from survival, and morality was taught not only as custom but as divine truth. Through prayers, rituals, festivals, and discipline, medieval children grew up in a world where religion touched every part of life. It shaped their mornings and evenings, their meals and work, their play and learning. Faith was not something they chose. It was the air they breathed, carried into adulthood as naturally as the skills of labor and household management. Even though medieval childhood was filled with work and duty, children still played. Play was not seen as separate from life, but as part of growing, learning, and preparing for adult roles. It offered moments of relief in a hard world and gave children the chance to build strength, test their abilities, and form bonds with others their age. The games they played were simple, the toys plain, but these activities were important in shaping social life and resilience. Toys were often homemade. Wooden dolls, carved by fathers or older brothers, provided companionship for girls. Rag dolls sewn from scraps of cloth were common, their clothes stitched from leftover fabric. Boys played with wooden swords or small shields, pretending to be knights. Balls were made from stitched cloth stuffed with rags, leather filled with hair, or even inflated animal bladders. Pebbles, bones, and sticks could become game pieces, transformed by imagination into tools of play. Children did not need much. The ordinary objects of life were enough to spark games. Group games filled villages and fields. Children chased each other in running games, wrestled, or played tag-like contests. They tossed balls, sometimes with rules that resembled early versions of football, though far rougher and less organized than today's sport. They played with hoops, rolling them along the ground, and skipped stones across ponds. In winter, children slid on frozen streams, pulling each other on makeshift sleds or simply sliding on shoes worn smooth by ice. Singing and song games were also popular. Children learned chants and rhymes that accompanied skipping, clapping, or circle dances. These songs were often passed down through generations, part of oral tradition. They taught rhythm, memory, and social coordination. At festivals, children might join in dances with adults, copying steps and learning the patterns of community celebrations. For noble children, play reflected their expected futures. Boys practiced with wooden weapons, learning how to balance, aim, and defend. They rode ponies, hunted small animals, and played mock battles. Girls played with dolls, practiced sewing miniature cloths, or took part in music and singing. Their games mirrored their adult roles. For boys, combat and leadership. For girls, household and refinement. Play also acted as training for resilience. Wrestling, climbing trees, or running long distances strengthened children's bodies. Games that involved chasing or mock fighting prepared boys for the demands of work or war. Cooperative games taught children how to work together, while competitive ones taught them endurance and fairness. Even simple pastimes carried lessons for later life. Socialization happened naturally through play. Children formed friendships, built rivalries, and learned rules of cooperation. They discovered the limits of strength, the importance of sharing, and the consequences of quarrels. In villages, mixed age groups played together, with older children guiding or sometimes bossing younger ones. This mirrored adult life, where hierarchy and cooperation were equally important. Religious festivals and holy days also provided opportunities for play. While adults gathered for feasts or services, children ran freely, enjoying rare moments of abundance. They played near village greens, mimicked the dances of their elders, and enjoyed treats that came only on special occasions. These moments gave them joy and a sense of belonging to the rhythms of the wider community. Play was not without risks. Rough games sometimes led to injuries, and lack of supervision meant accidents were common. But in a world where hardship was constant, play gave children brief escapes from labor and worry, spaces where imagination could thrive. Even in noble courts, where training and manners dominated, children laughed, played, and found pleasure in games. Whether chasing each other in courtyards or playing music together, they enjoyed moments of lightness before stepping into the heavy duties awaiting them. In this way, medieval children, whether peasant or noble, grew up with a mix of labor and play. Their games were not luxuries but necessities, helping them grow stronger, build relationships, and prepare for adult life. They remind us that even in harsh times, children found ways to laugh, run, and imagine, keeping alive the universal spirit of childhood. For all the moments of play, song, and family warmth, the reality of childhood in the Middle Ages was often harsh. Life was fragile, and children grew up with risks that began at birth and never fully disappeared. Survival itself was uncertain, and even those who reached adulthood carried the marks of hardship from their earliest years. The greatest danger was illness. Diseases spread quickly in medieval villages and towns, where clean water and sanitation were limited. Fevers, coughs, stomach sickness, and infections claimed many young lives. Without effective medicine, even minor illnesses could become fatal. Parents turned to herbs, prayers, and home remedies, but results were uncertain. The death of infants and young children was common enough that families often experienced it more than once. Each loss was a heavy grief, but it was also a fact of life that communities were forced to endure. Famine and hunger were constant threats. Bad harvests meant families had little food to eat, and children suffered first. Malnutrition weakened their bodies, making them vulnerable to disease. Winters were especially hard, when food stores ran low and families stretched bread and broth as far as possible. Children learned early what it meant to live with hunger. For some, survival meant eating coarse bread, thin porridge, or whatever roots and herbs could be found in the fields. Accidents were another danger. Children grew up in environments filled with open fires, sharp tools, and heavy animals. A child could be burned by the hearth, injured in fields, or trampled by livestock. Rivers and wells were necessary for water, but also posed the risk of drowning. Without modern protections, childhood was full of hazards, and families had to watch constantly, though even vigilance could not prevent every accident. Discipline was also strict and often severe. Medieval society valued obedience, and children were expected to respect parents, masters, and elders without question. Harsh punishments were common, both in homes and in apprenticeships. A child who disobeyed might be beaten, scolded, or made an example of. Discipline was not seen as cruelty but as necessary training, shaping children to endure hardship and follow the order of society. The expectation to work was another reality of medieval childhood. From an early age, children were needed to carry water, gather fuel, or help in fields. By their early teens, they often worked nearly as much as adults. Childhood was short, and there was little time for prolonged dependence. Even when children played, their games often mirrored the labor and roles they would soon take on. For noble children, harsh realities took different forms. They might have had better food and safer environments, but their futures were heavily controlled. Boys destined for knighthood faced years of physical training, discipline, and sometimes dangerous combat practice. Girls faced the certainty of arranged marriages, often made for family alliances rather than personal choice. From an early age, noble children were reminded that their lives were not their own, but belonged to their families and estates. Death and grief shaped medieval childhood deeply. Many children lost siblings to illness or parents to disease and war. Orphans were taken in by relatives, neighbors, or monasteries, but their futures were uncertain. Some became servants, apprentices, or laborers, living lives marked by hardship from an early age. Even those who grew up with both parents knew that loss was always possible. The harshness of life did not mean that families felt less love. Parents mourned lost children, cared for the sick, and tried to protect them from danger. But the reality of the age was that survival was fragile, and childhood could not be prolonged. Children were expected to accept hardship as part of life, to endure hunger, illness, and strict discipline, and to step into adult responsibilities as soon as they were able. In this way, childhood in the Middle Ages was shaped as much by hardship as by affection. It was a time of learning and growth, but also of constant risk. The resilience required to survive these years produced adults who were accustomed to difficulty, shaped from their earliest memories by the realities of a world where life was uncertain and often short. In the Middle Ages, the line between childhood and adulthood was not sharply defined. There was no long period of adolescence as we think of it now. Instead, children were gradually drawn into adult roles, and by their early teens, many were already living with responsibilities that marked them as adults in the eyes of their families and communities. The transition was shaped by work, marriage, training, and duty, and it came early, sometimes harshly, but almost always inevitably. For peasant children, adulthood often began with work. By the age of 12 or 13, boys could plow fields, drive oxen, or work long days at harvest alongside men. Girls of the same age managed hearths, cooked full meals, spun and wove cloth, and cared for younger siblings. These were not apprenticeships but real responsibilities, expected and necessary for household survival. By their mid-teens, peasant children were considered strong enough to contribute fully, and many were already thinking about the families they themselves would one day raise. Marriage marked one of the clearest transitions. In many places, marriages happened young by modern standards. Peasant girls might marry in their mid-teens, boys a little later when they were able to support a household. For noble families, marriages were often arranged in childhood and carried out as soon as children reached their early or mid-teens. These unions were less about personal choice and more about survival or alliance, but for the individuals involved, they marked the end of childhood and the beginning of adult responsibility. For boys in noble families, the path to adulthood was structured by the stages of knighthood. At about 7 years old, a boy might become a page in the household of another noble. At 14, he advanced to squire, training directly under a knight, learning combat, horsemanship, and the codes of honor and service. By his late teens or early 20s, if he had proven his skill and loyalty, he could be knighted, a ceremony that marked his formal transition into adult status. This was both a personal milestone and a public recognition of his new role in society. For noble girls, adulthood came through marriage and the management of households. From their earliest years, they were prepared for this role, taught sewing, embroidery, household management, and the etiquette of noble life. Once married, sometimes as young as 14 or 15, they were expected to oversee estates, manage servants, and bear children. Their transition to adulthood was swift, moving from daughters under the care of their parents to wives and mothers with significant responsibilities. Apprenticeship offered another pathway into adulthood, especially for town and village children. Boys as young as 10 or 12 were apprenticed to craftsmen, blacksmiths, bakers, weavers, or carpenters. They left their families to live with masters, working long hours in exchange for food, shelter, and training. Apprenticeship could last several years, and by the end, a boy was considered ready to work as a journeyman, earning his own wage and standing as an adult member of the trade. Girls, too, sometimes apprenticed in crafts like weaving or midwifery, though more often they remained tied to household roles. Religion marked adulthood as well. Confirmation, confession, and participation in sacraments signaled readiness to take responsibility for one's faith. Young people were expected to attend church regularly, fast, and obey religious obligations. In this sense, adulthood was not only about work or marriage, but also about stepping fully into the spiritual responsibilities of Christian life. The harshness of medieval life meant that childhood was short. By modern standards, children grew up quickly. By their early teens, many were already considered adults in practice, if not in years. They worked, married, served, or fought. They carried burdens that today would be placed on older shoulders. This early transition produced generations of adults hardened by experience, shaped from their youth to endure labor, duty, and hardship. Yet these transitions were also moments of pride and recognition. A boy becoming a squire, a girl managing her first household tasks as a wife, or a young apprentice completing training. These milestones were celebrated within families and communities. They reminded everyone that, despite the hardships of childhood, young people carried society forward, stepping into roles that ensured continuity. In this way, the transition to adulthood in the Middle Ages was not marked by freedom or leisure, but by responsibility. It came early, but it was accepted as natural, for survival demanded it. Medieval children grew up not to extend youth, but to shorten it, moving swiftly into the duties that defined their place in a world where every hand was needed, and every life was pressed into service of family, community, and faith. When we step back and look at the Middle Ages as a whole, childhood appears less as a separate stage of innocence and more as a brief introduction to the demands of survival. Children were not sheltered from the realities of life. They were part of them from the start. From the moment of birth, when survival itself was uncertain, to the early teens, when adult responsibilities began, childhood was short, practical, and shaped by hardship. Yet within this harshness, children learned the skills, values, and resilience that kept medieval society alive. The picture of childhood in these centuries is one of participation rather than protection. Children were not set apart from adults but included in their world. They watched, imitated, and joined in. They learned to carry water, tend animals, and recite prayers almost as soon as they could walk and speak. By doing so, they became useful to their families, even at a young age. Survival in medieval communities required every member to contribute, and children were no exception. The differences of class shaped these experiences but did not erase the hardships. Peasant children grew up close to the soil, tied to the rhythm of planting and harvest, sharing in the labor of their families from their earliest years. Noble children grew up in castles and manors, with servants and tutors, but their lives were directed by strict training, arranged marriages, and the weight of family expectations. Whether in cottages or great halls, children were expected to prepare early for the roles they would play as adults. Religion ran through childhood as a constant thread. Children were baptized almost immediately after birth, taught prayers before they could read, and introduced to the church calendar through feasts and fasts. Faith shaped their sense of right and wrong, framing obedience as a spiritual duty. It reinforced discipline and tied their lives to the larger rhythms of society. For many, religion also provided comfort, offering explanations for suffering and promises of salvation in a world where death was always near. The harsh realities of childhood cannot be overlooked. Illness, famine, and accidents claimed many lives before adulthood. Those who survived often carried scars, both physical and emotional, from early hardships. Discipline was strict, expectations high, and freedom limited. Childhood was not a long season of exploration, but a brief passage into duty. Yet within this harshness, children found moments of joy. Games with dolls or balls, songs sung in circles, laughter during festivals, and companionship with siblings and friends. These small joys balanced the weight of survival, reminding us that even in hard times, the spirit of play endured. The transition to adulthood came early. By 12 or 13, most children were already seen as young adults. Boys worked in fields, apprenticed in workshops, or trained for knighthood. Girls spun, cooked, managed households, and prepared for marriage. By their mid-teens, many were married, apprenticed, or serving in households beyond their own. Childhood, as we think of it today, ended quickly, replaced by the responsibilities of adulthood. In the bigger picture, medieval childhood reveals the resilience of families and communities. Parents, despite the hardships, invested love and care in their children. They sang to them, taught them prayers, and tried to prepare them for survival. Communities supported each other during births, illnesses, and losses. with neighbors, midwives, and priests playing important roles. Childhood was not a private experience but a shared one, shaped by the whole network of household, village, and church. Looking back, it is clear that medieval childhood was both fragile and formative. Fragile, because life could be cut short at any moment by sickness or hunger. Formative, because children learned from the very start the values of endurance, duty, and cooperation that medieval society depended on. They were not sheltered from the world, they were part of it, molded by its challenges and bound to its expectations. In the end, the story of how children grew up in harsh times is a story of survival through participation. Childhood was not a time set aside for innocence, but a time of preparation. It was short, demanding, and often dangerous, yet it produced generations who carried forward the rhythms of life in villages, towns, and castles. Their lives remind us that even the youngest in medieval society bore responsibilities, and through their labor, faith, and resilience, they helped sustain the world around them. The first light of dawn would have crept through the small, oiled parchment window of a wattle and daub cottage, a pale, diffused glow that did little to push back the shadows, but signaled the start of another long day. A child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, would stir on a mattress stuffed with straw, sharing its scratchy warmth with siblings, the family dog, and the pervasive earthy smell of the packed dirt floor. This was not a world of alarm clocks or the gentle persuasion of a parent. The day began with necessity. The chill in the air, the grumble of an empty stomach, the lowing of the cow in the byre that needed milking, these were the relentless, unchanging calls to action that shaped a childhood. There was no concept of adolescence, no prolonged period of sheltered innocence. From the moment a child could walk steadily and understand simple commands, they were a part of the great grinding engine of survival, a small but vital cog in the family and the community. Their play was imitation of work, and their work was the foundation upon which their entire world was built. Imagine the small hands of that child, not reaching for a brightly colored toy, but for a wooden bucket. Their first responsibilities were tiny echoes of the immense labors of their parents. They might be tasked with scattering grain for the chickens, their laughter mingling with the frantic clucking and flapping as they learned the rhythms of feeding and care. They would follow their mother to the garden plot, their small fingers learning to distinguish a stubborn weed from a fragile seedling, their world contained within the boundaries of those cultivated rows. They learned the language of the earth, the smell of rain on dry soil, the feel of a ripe apple yielding to a gentle twist, the warning buzz of a bee near the hives. This education was not taught through words in a book, but through immersion, a constant, silent curriculum of observation and participation. A child learned the value of a straight furrow by walking behind their father's plow. They understood the fragility of life by holding a warm, newly laid egg, or by witnessing the harsh reality of a winter that claimed a weak lamb. Their classroom was the entirety of their environment, and their teachers were the sun, the soil, the seasons, and the stern, loving guidance of their family. The village itself was a universe, its boundaries marked by the familiar ring of the great forest, a place of both bounty and deep, primal fear. The child's world was not large in terms of geography, but it was infinitely deep in its interconnectedness. They knew every rut in the path to the well, every creaking board in the footbridge over the stream, the exact spot where the blackberries grew thickest and sweetest in late summer. They knew their place within a strict hierarchy, a great chain of being that stretched from God in heaven down to the lowliest creature in the field. They learned to bow their head to the lord of the manor, to show respect to the parish priest, and to understand that their family's tenure on their strip of land was part of a web of obligations and duties that had existed long before they were born and would continue long after they were gone. This instilled not a sense of limitation, but rather a profound sense of belonging. They were a necessary part of a whole. Their labor, however small, contributed to the meal on the table, the thatch on the roof, the strength of the community. This was a core lesson of their childhood. Your actions matter, your presence has weight and purpose. For the vast majority of children, this life of agricultural toil was their entire destiny. But for some, a different path beckoned, one that required leaving home, often as young as 7 or 8. This was the path of apprenticeship. A child with a spark of curiosity or a family connection might be sent to a nearby town to live in the household of a master craftsman, a blacksmith, a baker, a weaver, or a mason. This was not a soft transition. They exchanged the familiar sights and smells of the village for the soot-choked, noisy, crowded confines of a craftsman's workshop. Their new life was one of utter subservience. They were the apprentice, the lowest of the low. Their days began before the sun and ended long after it had set. Their tasks were the most menial: sweeping the floor, stoking the forge, minding the master's younger children, running endless errands. They slept in a corner of the workshop or in a loft above it, their rest often interrupted by the demands of their master. Yet within this harsh existence was an incredible opportunity. They were being granted access to a mystery, the secret knowledge of a craft. They learned not just by being told, but by being surrounded. The rhythm of the hammer on the anvil, the specific scent of baking bread at each stage, the complex dance of the loom, these things seeped into them through their pores. They learned through countless mistakes, often met with a cuff on the ear or a sharp word, but they learned. They progressed from sweeping to fetching tools, then to preparing materials, and finally, after years of patient, observant labor, they might be allowed to attempt a simple task under the watchful, critical eye of the master. This was an education in patience, resilience, and pride. To create something from raw materials, to see a useful, beautiful object emerge from your own skilled hands, was a powerful and transformative experience. The journey from clumsy novice to journeyman, and perhaps one day to master, was a long and arduous road, but it was a road that led to a respected place in the world, a tangible identity forged in fire and diligence. For a select few, another door opened, the door of the monastery or the convent. A child, often from a noble family or one with pious connections, might be offered to the church, a practice known as oblation. This was a life utterly removed from the secular world. Within the cold stone walls of the abbey, a child's life was regimented by the divine office, the canonical hours that divided the day and night into periods of prayer, work, and study. The bell was their master, calling them to matins in the deep darkness of night, to lauds at dawn, to prime, terce, sext, none, through the day, and finally to compline before sleep. For a child with a scholarly mind or a deeply spiritual nature, this could be a haven. They exchanged the uncertainty and physical brutality of the outside world for a life of intellectual and spiritual pursuit. They were taught to read and write, a skill that placed them among a tiny, powerful minority. They learned Latin, the language of God and scholarship, and spent hours in the scriptorium, painstakingly copying ancient texts by the light of a tallow candle, their hands cramping but their minds soaring through philosophy, theology, and history. This life demanded the ultimate sacrifice, the renunciation of personal desires, family, and the prospect of children of their own. They were to consider themselves married to Christ, their loyalty belonging entirely to their monastic family and their abbot or abbess. The discipline was severe, the silence often profound, the focus inward and upward. Yet, within this rigid structure, a child could find a different kind of freedom, the freedom from want, from the fear of starvation or violence, and the freedom to explore the vast landscapes of faith and knowledge. They were tending a different kind of garden, one not of vegetables, but of the soul and the mind. Their contribution was not measured in bushels of wheat, but in prayers offered, manuscripts preserved, and a life dedicated to a purpose greater than themselves. But this world of work and duty was not devoid of joy or lightness. The laughter of medieval children was not a rare sound. It simply echoed in a different key. Their toys were what they could find or make. A simple stick became a knight's sword, a knotted piece of rope a challenge for a game of skill, a blown bladder from a slaughtered pig, a ball to kick and chase. They played tag in the churchyard, rolled hoops along the village paths, and told stories and sang songs that had been passed down for generations, tales of cunning foxes and foolish wolves that contained the distilled wisdom of the ages. The rhythm of their play followed the rhythm of the year, punctuated by the great festivals of the church and the ancient pagan celebrations that still lingered beneath the surface. Christmas was not a single day but the 12 days of Christmas, a time of revelry, feasting, and the suspension of the normal social order. Children might witness the Feast of Fools, where a boy bishop was elected, and the lowly were temporarily exalted. May Day brought the bringing in of the May, the dancing around the maypole, a celebration of fertility and the return of life to the earth that was as old as the hills themselves. There were fairs where jongleurs and acrobats performed marvels, filling their heads with wonder and dreams of distant places. These moments of collective joy and celebration were vital. They were the bright threads woven into the rough gray fabric of daily life, reminders that community, laughter, and celebration were just as essential to survival as bread and shelter. They bonded the community together, from the smallest child to the eldest elder, in a shared experience of merriment and respite. The family unit was the fundamental fortress against the world. In an age of high infant mortality, where it was common for parents to bury some of their children, the bonds that did form were incredibly strong. Parents loved their children fiercely, a fact sometimes obscured by the practical necessities of their harsh lives. Swaddling was common, not to restrict the child, but because it was believed to help the infant's limbs grow. The clang of steel echoed through the mist-shrouded valleys, a grim symphony heralding the dawn of a new era. As the last vestiges of Roman authority faded like twilight over the British Isles, the land itself seemed to hold its breath, awaiting what would come next. Into this power vacuum stepped figures both historical and half-legendary, their stories woven into the very fabric of the emerging medieval world. One could almost hear the creak of longboats cutting through choppy waters, see the dragon-headed prows emerging from the morning fog, and feel the tremor in the earth as foreign boots touched native soil. These were not the disciplined legions of Rome with their standardized armor and precise formations, but fierce warriors from the northern realms, their faces etched with the salt spray of the North Sea, their eyes burning with the promise of plunder and new beginnings. The Vikings did not merely raid. They came to stay, to settle, to reshape the cultural and political landscape in ways that would resonate for centuries. Their arrival marked not an ending, but a violent, tumultuous beginning, the birth pangs of what would eventually become the nations we recognize today. Along the eastern coasts of England and the riverways of Francia, monastic chroniclers recorded these incursions with trembling hands, their illuminated manuscripts depicting scenes of unimaginable terror. Lindisfarne, that holy island of learning and piety, fell first in 793, its sacred treasures looted, its monks slaughtered or taken as slaves. The message was clear. No place was safe, not even the house of God. The Viking longships, swift and shallow drafted, could navigate not only open ocean but push deep inland via rivers, striking at the heart of unprepared kingdoms. They came for silver, for land, for glory in the halls of Valhalla, but their impact was far greater than the sum of their raids. Yet to portray them merely as mindless destroyers is to misunderstand them completely. They were also unparalleled explorers, reaching the shores of North America centuries before Columbus, establishing trade routes that stretched from the Caliphate of Baghdad to the icy fjords of Greenland. Their society was complex, with a thing, a governing assembly of free men, that planted the early seeds of representative governance. Their art, with its intricate interlace and gripping beasts, would influence aesthetics across the North. They were farmers, poets, law speakers, and merchants, as well as warriors. This duality, the capacity for both creation and destruction, is at the very heart of the medieval experience. While the Norse were reshaping the coastal realms, the interior of what had been the Western Roman Empire was undergoing a transformation equally profound, if less immediately violent. With the collapse of centralized administration, the old Roman villa economy, based on large-scale agriculture and trade, fragmented into self-sufficient pockets. The great roads, once patrolled by legions and bustling with imperial messengers, fell into disrepair, their stones pried loose by locals for building material. Trade networks contracted dramatically. A gold coin, once the standard currency of the empire, became a rare treasure, replaced by barter or low-value silver pennies. The world became smaller, more local, and infinitely more precarious. In this fractured landscape, power devolved to whoever could provide protection and order. This was the genesis of feudalism, a system of reciprocal obligations that would structure medieval society for centuries. It was not a designed system, but one that emerged organically from necessity. A local strongman, perhaps a retired legionary or ambitious landowner, would fortify his home, creating a rudimentary keep. The surrounding peasants, vulnerable to bandits or rival warlords, would pledge their labor and a portion of their harvest in exchange for his protection. He, in turn, might swear allegiance to a more powerful regional lord, offering military service in exchange for his own landholdings and legitimacy. This chain of personal loyalty, stretching theoretically from the lowliest serf to the king himself, created a web of interdependence that was the glue holding a fractured world together. The church provided the other, crucial pillar of stability. As imperial authority vanished, bishops and abbots often found themselves as the de facto rulers of their cities and the surrounding countryside. Monasteries, particularly those of the Benedictine order with its rule of ora et labora, pray and work, became islands of learning, agriculture, and industry in a sea of chaos. Behind their walls, monks not only preserved the texts of classical antiquity, copying Virgil, Cicero, and Plato by hand onto precious parchment, but also innovated. They developed new agricultural techniques, managed vast estates, and provided charity and medical care to the poor. The monastery was a beacon, a repository of knowledge, and a testament to the enduring human striving for order and meaning amidst chaos. Charlemagne's empire, stretching from modern-day France deep into Germany and Italy, was the first major political entity to arise from the ashes of the West. His court at Aachen became a center of a cultural revival now known as the Carolingian Renaissance. He recruited the greatest scholars of his age, Alcuin of York from England, Paul the Deacon from Lombardy, to oversee a project of educational and religious reform. Scriptoria across the empire labored to produce standardized, beautiful copies of the Bible and liturgical texts, giving us the clear, legible Carolingian minuscule script that is the ancestor of our modern lowercase letters. This was not a mere nostalgia for Rome. It was an attempt to build a new, Christian Rome, founded on faith and learning. But like so many medieval constructions, Charlemagne's empire was built on the force of his own personality. Upon his death in 814, it was divided among his squabbling grandsons by the Treaty of Verdun, 843, fracturing into the kernels of what would become France, Germany, and a messy Middle Kingdom. This fragmentation once again left Europe vulnerable, and the Vikings, sensing weakness, redoubled their attacks. Their raids evolved into full-scale invasions and settlement. In England, a great army led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok conquered vast swaths of territory, an area known as the Danelaw, where Danish custom ruled. Only the stubborn resistance of Alfred, King of Wessex, prevented the complete extinguishing of Anglo-Saxon culture. Alfred, a rare combination of warrior, scholar, and administrator, fortified towns, built a navy, and fostered a program of learning in English, not just Latin, laying the foundation for a unified English kingdom. Across the Channel, the Vikings besieged Paris and carved out a permanent territory of their own in what became Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Their leader Rollo swore fealty to the Frankish king, converting to Christianity and becoming a duke. In doing so, these Norse invaders were absorbed into the very feudal structure they had once terrorized, a process of assimilation that was happening all across the North Atlantic world. Within a generation, these Normans would become some of the most fervent exponents of Frankish culture and medieval Christianity, their restless energy soon to be unleashed on England, Italy, and the Holy Land. The 10th century was, in many ways, a century of consolidation and grim endurance. The Magyar horsemen from the steppes swept into Central Europe with a ferocity that rivaled the Vikings, while Saracen pirates harried the Mediterranean coasts. The common folk, the vast majority of the population, lived lives of relentless toil. Their world was the manor, a self-contained economic unit. The lord's domain land was worked by the peasants, who also tended their own strips in open fields, using a complex system of crop rotation to keep the soil fertile. Their days were governed by the seasons and the liturgical calendar of the church: planting, harvesting, feast days, and fasts. Life was short, often brutal, and deeply communal. The forest that pressed against their fields was a place of danger and mystery, the haunt of wolves, outlaws, and perhaps darker, older things not yet banished by the cross. Yet even in this world, there were glimmers of change. The climate began to warm slightly in what is known as the medieval warm period, leading to longer growing seasons and better harvests. The heavy-wheeled plow, capable of turning the rich, dense soil of northern Europe, came into widespread use, increasing agricultural yields. A three-field system of rotation replaced the older two-field system, leaving less land fallow each year. This agricultural revolution, quiet and unheralded, provided the surplus food that would allow populations to grow, trade to quicken, and towns to be reborn. By the turn of the first millennium, a new fervor gripped Christendom. The year 1000 had passed without the apocalypse many had feared, and a renewed sense of purpose and confidence emerged. This energy found its ultimate expression in the pilgrimage. Thousands of faithful undertook arduous journeys to sacred sites, to Rome, to the shrine of St. James at Compostela in Spain, and most importantly, to Jerusalem. The roads, silent for centuries. The clatter of hooves on the cobblestone streets of Constantinople echoed like a death knell for the world they had known. It was the spring of 1204, and the air, thick with the salt of the Bosporus and the smoke of countless fires, carried not the chants of Orthodox priests, but the guttural war cries of Frankish and Venetian crusaders. The great Theodosian walls, which had repelled every invader for nearly 9 centuries, from Persians and Avars to Arabs and Bulgars, had been breached not by some brilliant feat of military engineering, but by avarice, betrayal, and a profound perversion of sacred purpose. The Fourth Crusade, called by Pope Innocent III to reclaim Jerusalem from the grip of Saladin's heirs, had instead fallen upon the greatest Christian city on earth. Inside the walls, a scene of apocalyptic chaos unfolded. The Latins, their surcoats bearing the crosses of their faith, now wielded their blades against the very people they had sworn to protect on their journey to the Holy Land. They poured into the city like a torrent through a shattered dam, a flood of steel and religious fervor gone horribly astray. The citizens of Constantinople, from the silk-clad aristocrats in the hilltop palaces to the humble fishmongers in the harborside slums, were utterly unprepared. This was not a city accustomed to being sacked. It was the city that had been the unassailable heart of an empire for 1,000 years. Panic was a living thing, a screaming, scrambling beast that filled the wide Massey Avenue and the narrow alleyways alike. The Crusaders, their eyes wide with a mixture of pious zeal and naked greed, fanned out through the city. They did not see a metropolis of unparalleled beauty and ancient learning. They saw a prize, a treasure chest of unimaginable wealth that had been tantalizingly dangled before them by the cunning Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo. The blind octogenarian Doge, a figure of almost demonic cunning, was there himself, aboard his galley in the Golden Horn, directing the assault with a strategic mind that saw decades ahead. For Venice, this was not a diversion. It was the culmination of a long-desired plan to cripple its greatest commercial rival. The deeply in debt to the Venetians for their fleet, had become little more than a mercenary army in the service of Venetian ambition. The sack that followed was one of the most thorough and devastating in history. It was not merely a military conquest, it was an act of cultural annihilation. For 3 days, the frenzy of murder, rape, and pillage continued unchecked. The Crusaders, many of whom hailed from the muddy timber-built towns of Western Europe, were utterly dazzled and then enraged by the splendor they encountered. The gilded domes of churches, the intricate mosaics depicting saints with serene, all-knowing eyes, the palaces with their marble floors and porphyry columns. It all spoke of a refinement and a wealth that seemed almost blasphemous to their simpler, more austere worldview. Their desecration was, in part, an act of violent inferiority. They stormed the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, the spiritual and architectural marvel of Christendom. They battered down its mighty bronze doors, and once inside, they gaped at the vast dome that seemed to hang from heaven by a golden chain, at the 40 million tessera that formed the image of Christ Pantocrator in the summit, his gaze encompassing all of creation. But their awe quickly turned to rapaciousness. They threw down the great iconostasis of silver and smashed the holy icons. They pried gems from the pulpit and tore silk hangings from the walls. They brought mules into the sanctuary to haul away their plunder, and it is said that a common prostitute was set upon the patriarch's throne to sing bawdy songs and dance for the amusement of the drunken soldiers. The altar itself, a masterpiece of precious metals and enamels, was broken into pieces and divided among the barons. The very body and blood of Christ, reserved in the sanctuary, were spilled upon the floor and trampled under booted feet. The destruction was not limited to churches. The great imperial palace of Bocaleon, a sprawling complex overlooking the Sea of Marmara, was stripped bare. Its rooms, which had witnessed 1,000 years of imperial ceremonies, were now home to looting knights. They rummaged through chests of state documents, tossing priceless imperial decrees and treaties aside to get at the gold and jewels beneath. They shattered ancient statues from Greece and Rome, mistaking their pagan subjects for idols. The great hippodrome, the center of the city's civic life for centuries, was despoiled. Its 4 magnificent gilded bronze horses, a masterpiece of classical artistry, were wrenched from their place above the starting gates and shipped back to Venice to adorn the facade of San Marco, where they remain to this day as stark trophies of the conquest. The human cost was staggering. Though the initial massacre at the breaches was horrific, the true tragedy unfolded in the days that followed. Thousands of civilians were slaughtered indiscriminately. Scholars, artists, and craftsmen, the living repositories of a continuous cultural tradition stretching back to antiquity, were cut down, their knowledge lost forever. Libraries, some of the last surviving repositories of ancient Greek and Latin texts, were put to the torch, the accumulated wisdom of ages turning to ash and blowing out over the waters of the Golden Horn. Women of all classes suffered unimaginable horrors. The city's population, which had numbered close to 500,000 at its height, was decimated, its survivors scattered, enslaved, or left to starve amidst the ruins of their world. And the plunder, the sheer volume of wealth looted from Constantinople, was so vast that it dwarfed any treasure taken in Europe since the fall of Rome. Piles of gold, silver, jewels, silks, and relics accumulated in great heaps in the squares of the city, to be divided according to the pre-agreed terms between the Frankish Crusader lords and the Venetians. Relics, in particular, held immense spiritual and financial value. The crown of thorns, a piece of the true cross, the Holy Lance, the arm of St. John the Baptist, the head of St. James, these and countless other sacred objects were seized and dispatched to the West. Over the following centuries, they would find their way into the treasuries of cathedrals and chapels across France, Italy, and Germany, a constant haunting reminder of the great crime from which they had been torn. The flow of this looted treasure back to Europe would fundamentally stimulate the economies of the West and fuel a new era of artistic and architectural patronage, a renaissance built, in part, upon the corpse of Byzantium. In the aftermath of the smoke and blood, a new political reality was imposed. The Byzantine Empire was formally dissolved. In its place, the Crusader barons established the Latin Empire of Constantinople, with Count Baldwin of Flanders crowned as the first emperor in a hollow ceremony in the desecrated Asia Sophia. The vast Byzantine territories were partitioned on paper among the victors. The Venetians claimed the strategic ports and islands of the Aegean, solidifying their maritime dominance. Frankish knights were granted fiefdoms and titles across Greece and the Balkans, creating a patchwork of petty crusader states like the Kingdom of Thessalonica, the Principality of Achaia, and the Duchy of Athens. These Franco-Cratia, or rule of the Franks, would introduce the feudal system to these lands for the first time, with Western knights building tall, grim castles on the hilltops overlooking a subject, Greek population who viewed them with a mixture of terror, hatred, and contempt. But the empire was not so easily erased. The sack of 1204 did not kill Byzantium, it shattered it. From the fragments, 3 Greek successor states emerged like lifeboats from a sinking ship, each claiming the mantle of the true Roman Empire. In the northwest, in Epirus, The Despotate of Epirus was founded by Michael I Komnenos Doukas, a member of the ousted imperial Angelos family. It was a rugged mountainous realm that quickly began to expand its influence. To the east, on the remote shores of the Black Sea, the empire of Trebizond was proclaimed by Alexios and David Komnenos, grandsons of the last Komnenian emperor. Andronikos, isolated and wealthy from the silver mines and trade routes of the Pontic Alps, it would maintain a precarious independence for centuries, a last outpost of Hellenism. The most significant of these rump states, however, was the Empire of Nicaea, established in the fertile and defensible regions of western Anatolia, across the water from the ruined capital. Its founder was Theodore Alascaris, a son-in-law of the last Byzantine emperor before the fall, Alexios III, Angelos. A capable and energetic ruler, Theodore gathered the fleeing remnants of the Byzantine court, army, and church around him. The Patriarch of Constantinople himself, John X. Kamateros, fled to Nicaea, granting the new state an immeasurable amount of legitimacy and making it the undisputed center of Orthodox faith and Byzantine political aspiration. Nicaea was not some makeshift refugee camp. It was a state in waiting. Theodore and his successors carefully preserved Byzantine bureaucracy, law, and court ceremony. They fostered learning and the arts. The Nicaean army, though smaller than the old imperial forces, was well drilled and fiercely motivated by the dream of restoration. For 57 years, the court at Nicaea would keep the flame of Rome burning, a government in exile plotting. The clang of steel echoed through the misty morning as the Norman knights, encased in their chainmail hauberks that shimmered like 1,000 tiny silver fish scales, advanced upon the weary English shield wall. This was not merely a battle, it was the violent culmination of a complex web of oaths, ambitions, and betrayals that had stretched across the cold waters of the English Channel. The air, thick with the promise of rain and the iron tang of impending bloodshed, grew heavy with the collective breath of thousands of men, their fates hanging in the balance on this ridge near a small Sussex town that would forever after be known for this confrontation. Hastings. Harold Godwinson's housecarls, the professional corps of his army, stood firm. These were not simple farmers drafted into service. They were huscarls, sworn men, their loyalty bought and maintained with rings of gold and promises of land. They were the king's own, his personal retinue, and they formed the unbreakable spine of the English force. Their round shields, painted in a dizzying array of personal symbols and clan markings, were locked together, creating a formidable barrier, the famed shield wall, or Skjoldborg. In their hands they gripped the fearsome Danish long axe, a weapon that could cleave a horse and rider in two with a single, well-placed swing. Their faces, many bearded and grim, were set in expressions of stoic resolve. They had marched hard and fast from their stunning victory over Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge in the north, a feat of military logistics that was nothing short of miraculous for the age. Their bodies ached with fatigue, their limbs heavy from the long march south, but their spirits were buoyed by that recent bloody triumph. They had shattered the last great Viking army to ever threaten England's shores. They believed, with the fervor of men who have already stared into the abyss and emerged victorious, that they could do so again. Across the field, the Norman host was a different beast entirely. It was a tapestry of feudal obligation and opportunistic ambition, woven together by the sheer force of will of one man, Duke William the Bastard. He had spent months, years, assembling this force, calling in favors from his own Norman barons, promising untold wealth and lands in England to the adventurous knights of Brittany, Flanders, and even farther afield. His army was a combined arms force, a sophisticated military machine for its time. The corps was its heavy cavalry, knights on powerful destriers, horses bred for war and strength, their hooves capable of trampling a man into the mud. These knights were the medieval equivalent of tanks, a shock force designed to break enemy lines through sheer momentum and terror. But William was no mere brute. He complemented his cavalry with ranks of skilled archers and crossbowmen, whose job was to soften the enemy lines, to break the integrity of the shield wall with a hail of projectiles, creating gaps for his knights to exploit. And then there were the infantry, the levied spearmen and swordsmen who would engage the enemy line directly, pinning them in place. William himself, a figure of imposing stature, rode before his lines that morning. He was not in his full armor yet, allowing his men to see his face, to hear his voice. He gave a speech, a masterpiece of medieval propaganda, reminding them of Harold's perjury, how he had sworn an oath upon holy relics to support William's claim to the English throne, an oath he had now broken. He painted their invasion not as a greedy land grab, but as a holy crusade, blessed by the Pope himself, who had sent a papal banner to fly above the Norman lines. This was God's work, he declared, and the spoils of England would be their divine reward. The battle began not with a thunderous cavalry charge, but with the high whistling sound of arrows arcing into the gray October sky. The Norman archers, positioned on the forward slopes, loosed their first volley. The arrows rose, seemed to hang for a moment at their apex like a cloud of malevolent insects, before plummeting down towards the English lines. But the English ridge was a cleverly chosen position. The slope was steep, and the high wall of shields angled upwards provided excellent protection. Most of the arrows thudded harmlessly into the leather-faced wood of the shields, or sailed over the heads of the rear ranks to land in the empty woods behind. A few found marks, a cry would echo here and there as a man fell, but the wall held. Seeing the ineffectiveness of the archers alone, William ordered his infantry forward. With a great shout, the Norman and allied foot soldiers began their advance up the slope. They were a noisy, chaotic mob compared to the silent, disciplined English line. They clashed with a sound that was less a single crash and more a rolling, continuous thunder of wood on wood, metal on metal. The English housecarls, fighting from the higher ground, had the immense advantage. They swung their long axes in great sweeping arcs, scything through the attackers. The Norman infantry, armed with shorter swords and spears, struggled to get past the wall of shields and the deadly reach of the axes. The fight was brutal, intimate, and merciless. The air filled with the grunts of men exerting themselves, the screams of the wounded, the curses shouted in Old English and Norman French. The ground underfoot, already damp, began to churn into a bloody mire. For a time, it seemed the English would hold forever. Their position was strong, their morale high. They were fighting for their homeland, for their king, against a foreign invader. But William was a master tactician, and he saw that a direct assault was failing. He then employed a tactic that would become the stuff of legend, a maneuver that may have been planned or may have been a desperate, brilliant improvisation born on the field of battle. He ordered a feigned retreat. A section of the Norman left flank, comprised largely of Breton troops, suddenly broke. It did not look like an orderly withdrawal. It looked like a rout. They turned and fled down the slope, appearing to be in a complete panic. To the English on the right flank of Harold's army, many of whom were the less disciplined feared the peasant levy, this was an irresistible sight. The enemy was breaking. The day was theirs. Forgetting their king's strict orders to hold the wall, a great roar went up from these local levies and they broke ranks, pouring down the slope in pursuit of the fleeing Bretons, hungry for glory and plunder. It was a catastrophic mistake. The Breton retreat was a trap. Once the English had streamed down onto the level ground and become disorganized in their eager chase, the Norman knights, who had been waiting for this exact moment, wheeled around. The trumpets sounded a different note. The fleeing Bretons turned back, and the heavy cavalry slammed into the scattered, breathless Englishmen. It was a slaughter. The knights rode them down, lancing them from horseback, hacking at them with their swords. The isolated English fighters had no chance against the coordinated charge of armored horsemen. They were cut off from the main body on the ridge and annihilated. This success on the left inspired William. He began to repeat the tactic across the line. Volleys of arrows would pepper the shield wall, followed by infantry assaults that would then deliberately fall back in apparent disorder, tempting more and more Englishmen to break formation and give chase. Each time, the Norman cavalry would countercharge and massacre those who had been lured out. The shield wall, once impregnable, began to erode. Gaps appeared. The relentless pressure was taking its toll. The housecarls were tiring, their arms growing leaden from the constant work of death. And then, a rumor shot through the Norman ranks. a rumor that could have broken a lesser army. A cry went up that Duke William was dead. A wave of panic began to spread. The entire Norman enterprise hinged on William. Without him, it was just a leaderless band of mercenaries on a hostile shore. Seeing the uncertainty spreading through his lines, William did something breathtakingly brave. He galloped into the midst of his faltering troops, rode right up to the front line, and shoved his helmet back onto his head, revealing his face, contorted with fury and determination. "Look at me," he roared, his voice cutting through the din of battle. "I live, by the grace of God, I live and I will conquer. Follow me." The effect was electric. His men, heartened and shamed, rallied to him with a renewed fury. The attack on the English center intensified, now fueled by a desperate need to redeem themselves in their duke's eyes. The battle reached a new, even more ferocious pitch. The afternoon wore on, the sun struggling to break through the clouds, illuminating a scene of apocalyptic horror. The ridge was now a charnel house, littered with the dead and dying. The famous Bayeux tapestry would later depict this moment with the stark Latin inscription, Hic succederant simul Angli et Franci in prelio. Here English and French fell together in the battle. The critical moment came as the day began to wane. The English line, though hemorrhaging men, was still holding around its core, the place where King Harold's personal banners, the Fighting Man and the Dragon of Wessex, flew proudly. Harold himself, surrounded by his bravest housecarls, fought like a demon. But William had identified the heart of the enemy. The clang of steel echoed through the mist-shrouded valley, a discordant symphony of survival. Beneath the heavy leaden sky, two armies faced one another across the sodden field, the air thick with the scent of damp wool, cold sweat, and the iron tang of fear. This was not the stuff of romantic tapestry or minstrel song. This was the grim, mud-spattered reality of medieval warfare. On the left, the levies of a local baron, men pulled from their plows and forges, gripped their billhooks and spears with white-knuckled intensity, their padded jacks offering meager comfort against the professional killers arrayed before them. Opposite them stood the core of the conflict, a company of mercenaries, their gear a motley collection of loot and payment, their eyes hard with the practiced indifference of men for whom battle was a trade. And between them, a no-man's land of churned earth and future graves. The charge, when it came, was not a glorious thundering line of knights as chronicles so often depict, but a ragged, roaring surge of infantry. There was no uniformity, no neat ranks. It was a chaotic, violent scrum, 100 individual duels coalescing into a single, monstrous entity of conflict. The first impact was a sickening crunch of wood and bone. A farmer, his face a mask of terrified determination, thrust his spear forward, the point skidding off a mercenary's worn brigandine before finding a gap at the armpit. The man screamed, a high, wet sound that was swallowed instantly by the general din, and fell, his lifeblood soaking into the greedy earth. There was no time for the farmer to ponder his first kill. A axe-wielding brute was already upon him, the weapon a blur of deadly motion. Above this melee, on a slight rise, the baron himself sat astride his destrier, a mountain of muscle and steel. His visor was up, revealing a face etched with the grim calculus of command. He watched his line buckle and sway, a living thing under immense pressure. His knights, a small cadre of household men encased in full plate, were his reserve, his hammer. He held them back, his jaw tight, waiting for the precise moment when the enemy's formation would thin, when exhaustion would set its claws into the mercenaries' limbs. Timing was everything. To commit too soon was to waste their shock value in the grinding press. Too late, and the battle would be lost before they ever moved. Down in the fray, the reality of close quarters combat was a sensory overload of brutality. The world shrank to the space of a few feet. Men fought not with finesse, but with a desperate animalistic ferocity. A billhook snagged a man's leg, pulling him screaming to the ground where he was quickly finished by dagger thrusts to the neck. A poleaxe, swung with two-handed force, crashed through a kettle helmet, ending a life with final, brutal efficiency. The mud underfoot became a pinkish, treacherous slurry, making footing precarious. Men slipped on the entrails of the fallen, rising only to be cut down themselves. The noise was a physical force, a cacophony of shouted curses, war cries that were more shrieks of terror than defiance, the grunts of exertion, the shriek of metal on metal, and the wet, ugly sounds of metal meeting flesh. And then the moment came. The mercenary captain, a grizzled veteran with a scar running from hairline to chin, had overextended his center in pursuit of a breaking group of levies. A gap yawned in their line. The Baron's arm shot up and then swept down. A single, silent command. With a deep-throated roar that cut through the battle's chaos, the knights kicked their massive warhorses into a charge. It was not the full tilt gallop of a jousting list. The ground was too soft, the press too thick. It was a terrifying, deliberate, earth-shaking trot that gathered momentum with every stride. The sun, breaking momentarily through the cloud, glinted on their polished plate, making them appear as avenging angels descending into the hell of mortal combat. They lowered their lances, a steel-tipped forest aimed at the heart of the enemy formation. The impact was catastrophic. The destriers, trained for this very purpose, slammed into the rear of the mercenary ranks. The lance of the Baron's captain took a man full in the chest, punching through his mail hauberk as if it were parchment, the force of the blow lifting him clean off his feet and hurling him backwards into his comrades. The knight dropped the shattered lance and in one fluid motion drew his longsword, the blade a shimmering arc of light as he began to lay about him with methodical, devastating power. Against unarmored or lightly armored men, a knight on horseback was less a soldier and more a force of nature. The sword rose and fell, shearing through limbs, crushing skulls, and opening throats. The charge did not just kill the men it hit, it shattered morale. The mercenary line, which had been pushing forward with confidence moments before, disintegrated into a panicked mob. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. The rout was on. Men threw down their weapons, turning their backs on the enemy in a desperate bid for survival, the most dangerous moment of any pre-gunpowder engagement. The Baron's levies, their own fear transmuted into vengeful fury, fell upon the fleeing men with a savage intensity. The knights, their initial charge spent, now moved through the chaos like harvesters, their swords reaping a grim toll. The mercenary captain tried to rally a few of his veterans, forming a desperate shield wall, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with bare hands. They were surrounded, and the circle around them tightened relentlessly. The captain fought like a demon, his notched sword a blur, parrying a knight's overhead blow and ramming his dagger into the gap between the knight's breastplate and tasset. The knight groaned, slumping in his saddle, but another took his place. Weakened, his shield arm numb from blocking a mace blow, the captain finally stumbled. A spear took him in the back of the thigh, and he went down to one knee. He looked up, his one good eye glaring defiance, as the Baron himself approached, his sword point lowered. There were no words of honor, no offer of ransom. This was not a chivalric duel between nobles. This was the end of a business transaction gone wrong. The Baron's sword thrust forward, quick and efficient, and the light faded from the captain's eye. The battle was over. As the adrenaline faded, the field was revealed in all its horrific grandeur. The cacophony of combat was replaced by a new, more dreadful chorus, the moans and whimpers of the wounded and the dying. The crows, which had been circling patiently overhead, began to descend, their black forms hopping amidst the carnage. The victors moved slowly now, their bodies aching with a deep, profound exhaustion. They began the grisly work of sorting the field. Their own wounded were carried gently to the rear, where the Baron's surgeon, a butcher with more courage than skill, would do his work with needle, thread, hot iron, and saw. The enemy wounded received a quicker, more merciful end from a dagger or a hammer. Looters, camp followers who had shadowed the army, now darted among the dead, stripping bodies of anything valuable, rings, purses, weapons, and boots. The Baron removed his helmet, his face pale and streaked with sweat and grime. He surveyed the field, his victory feeling hollow and costly. He had preserved his lands, his title, his right to rule this patch of earth, but at a price measured in the broken bodies of the men who worked it for him. He saw a young boy, no older than 16, kneeling beside the body of an older man, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The Baron turned away. This was the true face of the feudal contract. protection purchased with blood, both given and taken. The field, for now, was his. But the memory of its cost would linger in the air longer than the stench of death, a permanent scar upon the land and upon his soul. The political map had been redrawn, not with ink and parchment, but with steel and suffering, a constant reminder that in the medieval world, power was never given, only taken, and held by the relentless and the ruthless. This localized conflict, a mere footnote in the grand chronicles of the era, was a microcosm of the forces that shaped the High Middle Ages. It was an age defined by this constant grinding tension between order and chaos, between the lofty ideals of chivalry and the brutal realities of power. To understand this period is to move beyond the castles and cathedrals and immerse oneself in the complex, often contradictory systems that governed life. The rigid hierarchy of feudalism, the spiritual omnipresence of the church, the intellectual awakening of the universities, and the economic transformations that would eventually sow the seeds of the Old World's destruction. The feudal pyramid, a tapestry of obligation and power. The battle we just witnessed was, at its core, a direct result of the feudal system. The baron fought to defend land he held from his lord, perhaps a count or a duke, who in turn held it from the king. This was. The clang of steel echoed through the mist-shrouded valley, a discordant symphony that spoke of desperation and valor in equal measure. As the Norman cavalry thundered down the slope, their lance tips catching the first weak rays of morning light, the English shield wall held firm, a living, breathing fortress of interlocked oak and iron will. Harold Godwinson stood at the center, his crown gleaming beneath the helmet, eyes fixed on the approaching storm. He could feel the vibration of hooves through the soles of his leather boots, a tremulous rhythm that seemed to make the very earth shudder in anticipation. The first impact was a cataclysm of splintering wood and screaming horses. Norman lances shattered against the unyielding wall of shields, while Saxon battle axes rose and fell in terrible arcs, finding their marks in the vulnerable necks of warhorses and the gaps in knightly armor. The air grew thick with the coppery scent of blood and the pungent odor of frightened animals. William, watching from his saddle on a slight rise, gritted his teeth as his initial charge broke against that stubborn English line like waves against cliffs. He had not expected such resilience from these island dwellers, these sons of farmers and fishermen who stood as though rooted to the very soil they defended. For hours the battle raged, the sun climbing slowly through a sky now smudged with smoke from burning grass set alight by Norman arrows. The English position on Senlac Hill proved as tactically sound as it was psychologically formidable. Every charge uphill drained the strength from Norman mounts and wearied armored men struggling through mud churned to bloody mire. Yet the Norman archers took their toll, their high arcing arrows falling like deadly rain upon the densely packed defenders. Here and there gaps appeared in the shield wall as men fell with feathered shafts protruding from eyes, throats, and shoulders, their places immediately taken by others who stepped forward without hesitation, their faces set in grim determination. It was during one of the periodic lulls in the fighting, as the Normans regrouped for another assault, that Harold's brother Leofwine found himself standing shoulder to shoulder with the king. "They test our flanks like wolves circling a wounded stag," he murmured, wiping blood and sweat from his eyes with a mailed forearm. Harold nodded grimly, his gaze never leaving the Norman lines where William could be seen gesturing animatedly to his commanders. "The bastard knows time works against him," the king replied. "His army must forage in hostile land while our people bring us supplies under cover of night. He must break us today or not at all." Yet even as he spoke, a new strategy was taking shape in William's tactical mind. The Duke had noticed how portions of the English line tended to break formation when pursuing retreating Normans, a fatal enthusiasm that had already cost several Saxon lives earlier in the day. Now he devised a plan to exploit this weakness systematically. Calling his barons to him, he issued new orders. The next assault would include a feigned retreat, one designed to lure the English from their defensive position onto ground where his cavalry could maneuver properly. The subsequent Norman attack began with unusual ferocity, as if this were to be the final, desperate effort. Knights charged with renewed vigor, their war cries echoing across the battlefield. But then, quite suddenly, the right flank of the Norman army seemed to lose heart. Men turned their horses, dropping banners and weapons in apparent panic, racing back down the hill toward their own lines. A great roar went up from the English right where the peasant levies, stood alongside the more experienced housecarls. These men, less disciplined than the professional warriors, saw their chance for glory and plunder. Ignoring shouted commands to hold formation, hundreds broke ranks and poured down the slope in pursuit of what they believed to be a routed enemy. It was a fatal error. Once the English had abandoned their high ground and spread out in disorganized pursuit, William gave the signal. Norman cavalry wheeled about as one, their retreat transformed instantly into a deadly countercharge. The pursuing English, now scattered and breathless, were cut down mercilessly. Knights rode through them, swinging maces and swords with practiced efficiency, while archers poured arrows into them. Within minutes, the entire right flank of Harold's army had been effectively destroyed, creating a gaping hole in the English defenses. Seeing the disaster unfolding, Harold desperately tried to reform his lines, pulling men from the center to reinforce the weakened right. But this necessary adjustment created new vulnerabilities. The king himself moved toward the threatened sector, his personal standard drawing fighters to him like iron to a lodestone. It was at this moment of maximum confusion and repositioning that fortune, or fate, intervened in the most cruel manner. A stray arrow, launched by a Norman bowman who would never know the significance of his shot, arced high over the battlefield. It descended not as part of any concentrated volley, but as a solitary missile lost in the deadly rain. By chance alone it found its mark, striking Harold just above the right eye where his helmet offered no protection. The king staggered, his hand rising instinctively to the protruding shaft before he collapsed among the bodies of his housecarls. The cry went up along the English lines, "The king is fallen! Harold is dead!" Panic spread like wildfire through the weary ranks. Without their leader, without the unifying figure around whom their defense had been organized, the resolve of the English army began to crumble. Yet even in this moment of ultimate disaster, incredible heroism emerged. Harold's personal bodyguard, his housecarls, formed a circle around their fallen king and fought to the last man, buying precious time for the remnants of the army to withdraw or die with honor.